Okay, today's topic might be a bit unexpected, but we have to talk about Swedish traffic. Just a few months back, I spent a few weeks in Scandinavia. I went from Germany to Lapland and back, so I spent many days on the roads and most of these days in Sweden. And I noticed a few weird things along the road. For example, this beautiful landmark, which is obviously a cheese slicer. Why Sweden? Why? But I also noticed a few things on the road itself. First of all, every second person in Sweden obviously drives a Volvo. Second thing, every third person in Sweden obviously drives a vintage car. And I don't mean like 20, 30, 40-year-old cars. No, I mean really old American vintage cars like this one, for example, I saw in the town of Gränna in southern Sweden. But the third thing I noticed is actually the most interesting and the most funny thing, because I've never seen something like that in other European countries before. If you drive through Sweden, from time to time there will be a situation where you will get stuck in a traffic jam. And the reason for this traffic jam is always the same. It's a super weird looking, slow driving car that has no license plate on its back, but a huge warning sign. Those strange cars are all over Sweden. Some of them are super noisy, some of them are also a bit smelly, some of them have like weird decorations and lighting and stuff, but all of them are driving super slow. So I was wondering, what the heck is that? What's the story behind those weird, slow driving cars, and why is there obviously such a hype about them in Sweden? Well, let's find out. If you thought German people, like I am, have a weird obsession for cars, well, you might be right, but I think the Swedish car culture is even more interesting. The reason why there are so many Volvos on the road, for example, is quite obvious. Volvo is a Swedish company, so it's by far the best-selling car brand in Sweden, with 52,000 sold cars in 2020. Volkswagen is only on number 2 with 42,000, and Kia on number 3 with 25,000 sold cars. The reason for the vintage car hype in Sweden is a bit more interesting. After the Second World War, the Swedish government imported many vehicles from the US to meet the demand for cars in the country. In the 19th and 20th century, there were also many Swedish emigrants that came to the US and who supplied relatives with vehicles from abroad. Those cars are still driving around on the streets today, and especially if you drive through Sweden on the weekends, you almost feel a bit like you're in a different time zone or something. But, well, the most interesting thing is in fact the hype behind those weird, slow driving cars in Sweden. So let's check out the story behind them. Let's go back to the 1930s. At that time, there was a great need for agricultural machines in Sweden, but only a few farmers could actually afford them. So the Swedish government had an idea that obviously no other country had at that time, and an idea that still has impact today. The Swedish government created the possibility of converting old, ordinary cars into tractors. And, well, that's what the farmers did. This is how such a converted car looks like a strange mixture of a car and a truck. The farmers started to build those vehicles from material that was lying around on the farms anyway, and soon those strange cars also got a name. They were called EPA-Traktor, or EPA-Traktor translated, because EPA at that time was a Swedish cheap department store. So EPA-Traktor means something like cheap tractor. There were a few requirements that had to be taken to convert a car into a tractor. For example, the rear axle of the vehicle was not allowed to be sprung. The tractors were only allowed to have one row of seats, they had to have a loading area and a trailer coupling, and the engine output had to be throttled. But with everything else, the farmers could be as creative as they wanted to be. So in the 1930s and 40s, those EPA tractors became really popular on Swedish farms. And for many, many years, they did their job really, really well. However, in the 1950s, the hype around those EPA tractors slowly subsided. The prices for real agricultural machinery were slowly falling and more farmers could afford a real tractor. So the EPA-Traktor slowly died. But well, as you might know, every huge hype sooner or later will have a comeback. And that happened in the 1960s. The EPA tractor that was actually used as an agricultural machine now was used by the farmers' kids. The reason for that has something to do with the Swedish traffic law. In Sweden, you are allowed to drive such a slow-driving vehicle like the EPA-Traktor at the age of 15. A few decades ago, it was even allowed to drive such a car at the age of 14 if you were living on a farm. So what happened was, for many young people, the EPA-Traktor became a symbol of freedom. Since there was no real public transport in the countryside, many farmers' kids started to use those machines to drive to school or to meet with friends. Unfortunately, the Swedish government didn't really like this trend. There were a few politicians that saw those EPA tractors as a safety issue, and there were also a few teenagers that caused accidents with those machines. So in 1975, the EPA tractor finally was forbidden and the dream of freedom was over. In fact, there were a lot of protests at that time in Sweden because of this rule, and over the years the law changed many times. First, people were told to scrap their vehicles. Later, the government decided that people could keep them, but it was not possible to register new tractors anymore. And in the end, finally, a new rule was passed that was satisfactory for everybody. The rule of the so-called A-Traktor. In general, the A-Traktor is basically the same as the EPA tractor. It's still a converted car, but with a huge difference. From now on, a warning sign at the back of the car was mandatory, and the A-Traktor is only allowed to drive 30 kilometers per hour. And yep, you're absolutely right, those are the cars we still see on Swedish roads today. The funny thing about all this is, this EPA or A-Traktor thing exists for many years now in Sweden. But the real hype around those machines didn't start in the 70s or 80s or 90s. No, it started last year. And the reason for that is another change in the Swedish law. From now on, it's not only allowed to convert old cars into a tractor, from now on it's also allowed to convert newer models and also cars with automatic transmission. In the past, the upper gears of those old vehicles had to be blocked or a reduction gear was built in at great expense. Today, with newer models, the maximum speed can also be limited electronically. So what happened was, within just 1 year, the registration numbers of those A-Tractors rose by 27%. 36,000 people in Sweden are driving those cars meanwhile, and if you saw mostly converted old Volvos in the past, meanwhile you also see BMWs, Mercedeses, Audis, and there are also 76 Porsches registered for minors in Sweden. Meanwhile, the hype around those vehicles has become a real youth culture. If you drive through Sweden, especially in the evenings, you will see a lot of teenagers at gas stations where they are meeting with those cars and where they tinker with the car. Many of them also decorate their cars in an extraordinary way, for example with tree-shaped air fresheners or stickers. Of course, not everybody's happy with this development. Some say that those cars are still safety issues because they are driving so slow and other cars always have to overtake them and that might cause accidents. Others say those cars are still too fast for teenagers, but some also say it's actually the best thing that could happen to Swedish teenagers, because long before they have their driving license, they actually learn how to drive safely on Swedish streets, so it could also have a positive effect. I'm not really sure. What do you think about all this? Maybe write it down in the comment. Should this regulation also be possible in other countries? Would you buy an A-Traktor if you would have the chance? Let me know in the comments, and maybe we can discuss this topic a little bit. So, and that was my story about the EPA-Traktor and the A-Traktor in Sweden. I hope you learned something. If you did, then please leave a thumbs up. You can also hit the subscribe button of this channel so you won't miss any upcoming video. And if you like to support me and my work, then please check out the Patreon link in the description. So far, have a safe journey and see you next time.